First of all, my name is Pete Konetchy, and I've met just about everyone. But I am a candidate for Michigan's U.S. Senate seat in the 2012 election. So you know about me, I have my wife right here, Jana. We've been married about 20 years. We have 5 children. The youngest one is 17, and the rest are all out of the house. So I went to Michigan State University, and I got a degree in accounting. So I graduated there about many years ago, back in the 70s. Shortly after that, I started my own programming company. And the programming company provides software to lawyers, time billing and accounting software. So I started that, and I'm still working at that job now. We have about 200 law firms throughout the nation that we have long-term relationships with, and we just maintain their accounting systems. I'm a constitutional conservative. And that means that I feel that the power and the scope of the federal government are limited to the duties within the Constitution only and nothing more. I'm running for this seat because when I look around at our nation, I feel that it's being destroyed from within by politicians who are not following the Constitution and are implementing all these massive programs for their own political power. That's all. So I understand the greatness of our country, and the greatness of our country is not government. The greatness of our country is due to its commitment to personal liberty. And this personal liberty allowed the people of this nation to excel above all others in the world. When our ancestors came here, none of them came here for benefit whatsoever. They all came here just simply for the chance to choose their destiny. That's all they wanted. They wanted to be left to their own devices and left alone from government. The great majority of the leaders of my generation don't agree with this. They feel that the purpose of government is not only to cure, but to discover and cure every ill of society. And in order to cure these ills, they've implemented massive programs well outside the scope of the Constitution, greatly expanding the scope and power of government and stifling personal liberty and free enterprise. So I still feel that the United States is by far the greatest nation this world has ever seen. But to remain so, we have to address some very serious challenges. And this is where we can't be politically correct. For example, if you look at our status as a world superpower, the United States is in danger of losing its prominence as the world's economic superpower due to its overregulation and taxation. The proud, traditional American values that we grew up on are being replaced by a culture of entitlement. And we're amassing a crushing debt that we can't pay due to unsustainable deficit spending. So these have to be addressed. The immediate situation is that we have to balance our budget and we have to eliminate deficit spending. It's immoral for us to spend money we don't have, and it's not right for us to pass our debt onto our children that we are unwilling to pay. And I'm not saying unable to pay, because we can pay it if we put our mind to it, but we're unwilling to pay it. The only long-term solution that we have to saving our country, in my opinion, is to restore constitutional restraint by reversing the errors of our recent past. And I have a four-point approach that I would support fully. And the first one is that we have to purge unconstitutional federal control from every aspect of society. And that includes eliminating, through phasing out over time, the departments of labor, health and human services, housing and urban development, transportation, energy, education, and the Environmental Protection Agency. When I read my Constitution, there's nothing in Article 1, Section 8 or any place else in the Constitution that says the government should be involved in those functions. Plus, the people, the free market, or the states, if the people decide to give the states the authority, can handle these functions much better than a federal government. The next thing we have to do is government has shown, well, demonstrated incompetence in managing Social Security and Medicare. Again, there's no constitutional justification. They've literally bankrupted the programs and they've looted the trust funds. These programs have to be transitioned over to a fully funded, proven free market solution. But there can't be any loss of benefit to existing enrollees. So government has to honor its current obligation, but we have to phase the programs out so it's private. The next thing is we have to eliminate all federal entitlement programs. Because again, there's nothing in the Constitution that says, the government should be in charge of supporting who they think needs support. These programs destroy self-responsibility and self-respect. They encourage dependency on government. They reward sloth, punish productivity, and they do all this by bankrupting the country. The last thing we have to do is we have to make sure that we enforce our constitutional checks and balances. Because it's incumbent upon Congress to make sure that the president and the judiciary are held accountable if they exceed the constitutional authority. Like, for example, when the president hires these czars to implement policy. That's totally outside the Constitution. They should be held accountable. When the Supreme Court rules that the Supreme Court, but if a court rules that God cannot be in the Pledge of Allegiance, or the Supreme Court rules on international law versus the Constitution, that's unacceptable, and they should be held accountable by Congress. But the most important check against government abuse in the last resort are we the people, because we are the strongest check. It's incumbent upon us, the people, to hold our elected representatives accountable. And if they abuse our trust, any fashion whatsoever, we have to vote them out of office. That's the only thing we can do. We don't need a violent revolution. Our Constitution is a perfect document for governing a free people. We just have to adhere to its terms. So that's basically my stump speech. That's how I feel. So if there's any questions, I'd love to answer your questions.
Where do you stand on the UN?
I am not a friend of the UN. I think that they're destructive to the United States, and I would like to end our relationship with them.
Speaking of the UN, would you endorse that saying get the U.S. out of the UN and the UN out of the U.S.?
I would definitely do that. I forgot these charts. These charts are very important. This chart, this shows our debt. It's a graph of our debt. Yeah, it starts in 1900 right here, and it ends in 2020. Prior to 1980, we in effect had no debt to speak of. But in 1980, we started our deficit spending, and we went up and up and up. Right now, we're at $14 trillion, and they want to raise the debt ceiling more. It's unsustainable. My feeling on the debt is as follows. I know in 2009, well, first of all, the debt ceiling says we're supposed to borrow that much, and it's supposed to be a limit on borrowing. In 2009, we borrowed we raised it by $1.5 trillion, and there was no effort to cut federal spending. In 2010, we raised it an additional $2 trillion, and there was no effort whatsoever to cut federal spending. I know the Democrats are in power, we're in power at that point in time, and they do spend and spend and spend. We know that's their nature. But when the Republicans took hold in January 2011, I wanted them to put some brakes on spending, but there was no discussion whatsoever to limit spending to below the debt ceiling. Now we're at this crisis point right now where we're going to run out of money. My own feeling is no, do not raise the debt ceiling. We have to draw the line in the sand. We're at $14.5 trillion. If we raise it again, we're not going to cut spending. If we're serious about cutting spending, cut spending now. Pay for our constitutionally mandated duties, which include defense. It includes immigration, includes other functions in the Constitution, patent office, and so forth and so on. And then also the deficit in Social Security, because that's an obligation the government has to pay, and our debt. We can pay for that. We have $200 billion per month coming into the federal treasury, and we can pay for those costs. We don't have enough money to pay for all of the bloat. We don't have enough money for education, energy subsidies, entitlements, and the like. My feeling is that we have to cut the budget by whatever is necessary to live within our means. It's not simply the budgets, it's within our borrowing means. We have to limit it.
There seems to be an unholy alliance between Congress and the Federal Reserve, which isn't federal and it's not a reserve. Would you support the Ron Paul position of auditing the Fed with the hope of ending the Fed?
Oh, without a doubt. I don't claim to be an expert on the Fed, but from what I understand about the Fed, it's like I said, they can print money without any value whatsoever, and then they charge the United States interest on that money that they just made out of thin air. I would like to have our money based on a value, such as gold, precious metals, or whatever, but it has to be based on some sort of value. This is my second chart, and this is extremely important. This chart shows, it starts in 1787, way down here when the Constitution was ratified, and goes up to 2010. This shows the percent of federal spending to gross domestic product. And for the first 150 years of our nation's life, federal spending averaged 2 to 3% of gross domestic product. That's just 2 to 3%. Right now it's 25% of gross domestic product. The difference between 2 to 3% and the 25 is all spent on non-constitutional functions. The government decided that they were smarter than the people, they were smarter than our founders, and they were smarter than the free market system, and they're taking all this money out of the economy to spend as they deem proper. For the first 150 years, when we were down at 2 to 3% of gross domestic product, we did not have an income tax. We raised money as our founders proposed through duties, imposts, and excises. We were a free people because the government could not come in and take what we earned. Now that we're spending 25%, we have what I consider repressive taxes. The government's looking at every single avenue to get as much money away from the people as possible. And that's just wrong. We're no longer a free people if we have repressive taxes. So what my goal is my goal is to decrease spending from the 25% where it's currently at back down to the 2 to 3% level. Is it going to be easy? Of course it's not going to be easy. We're going to have to change the entire mindset of the nation from entitlement to freedom. But it's something that's worth fighting for, because if we don't fight for it, we're going to implode from our own debt and lose everything that our founders gave to us. So that's my goal. And I have a solution for it. It's not a hard solution. Maybe it's not even a workable, but I think it's a good start. Right now, at the federal level, we have something called baseline budgeting. And it says that the budget automatically increases a certain amount every single year unless Congress has the wherewithal to cut it. Okay, that's a disgrace in itself, but that's how it's set up. What I'd like to do is I'd like to have something called negative baseline budgeting. And for all of our constitutionally mandated programs, which I mentioned before, but primarily defense, I would never want to cut the functionality of those programs, because defense is the primary function of the federal government. If there's waste, such as bases we don't need or waste within the department, I have no problem with that, but I don't want to cut their functionality. But for all non-constitutionally mandated programs, which would include things like the Department of Education, Energy, entitlements, everything else, I'd like to have those programs cut by a certain amount every year. So say we budget a balanced budget this year, it'd be 100% financing. Next year, I'd like to have all those non-constitutional programs cut by 10%, as an example. So instead of being increased 10%, they'd be decreased 10%. Then every year thereafter, cut by the same amount as the original year. So then in 10 years, as an example, those programs would just fade away. It wouldn't be hard, it would be hard on people, but not real hard, because first of all, we'd lose people through attrition. People retire, they'd naturally go away, we just wouldn't hire them. People would know that these programs are being cut, so that they would just naturally get a new job. They wouldn't apply for federal government jobs or whatever. If you're on entitlements, like 1994, we had this big Welfare Reform Act. Everyone in the country, not everyone, but the liberals in the country were saying that when the Welfare Reform Act was implemented, it would cause chaos in the streets, because all these people would be out of work, they'd be poor, and so forth and so on, just problems after problems after problems. Well, that Welfare Reform Act went into place, and there wasn't even a whimper. People just got off the entitlement and they found their way into the private sector, is what it amounted to. So I think the same thing would happen if we started to decrease our federal spending.